October 24th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace. Queen Jane Seymour is dying. 12 days after delivering England's most wanted heir, her body is failing. The fever burns. The pain is unbearable. For 500 years, whispers haunted the halls of history. They said King Henry VIII ordered his doctors to cut her open while she was still alive. Save the boy. Let the mother die. It became legend. A monstrous choice by a monstrous king. But here's the truth they buried. Jane Seymour wasn't butchered by royal command. She was killed by something far more terrifying. Something invisible. Something unstoppable in 1537. And if you think you know how she died, you're about to learn why history lied. Hit subscribe right now, because the stories they tried to erase are the ones you need to hear. This is the death of Jane Seymour, and it's darker than you think. September 16th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace stood silent under heavy autumn skies. Inside the palace walls, Queen Jane Seymour withdrew into her birthing chamber, beginning the ancient ritual that had killed so many women before her. Heavy tapestries were drawn across every window. Candles flickered in the suffocating darkness, the air thick with incense and fear. Jane was 28 years old, Henry VIII's third wife, the quiet one, the obedient one, the one who replaced the executed Anne Boleyn and the discarded Catherine of Aragon. She had one purpose, one desperate mission that consumed the entire kingdom: give England a son. Henry had waited 28 years for a legitimate male heir. 28 years of failed marriages, dead infants, and daughters who could never inherit his throne. His obsession had fractured England's religion, destroyed families, and sent men and women to the scaffold. Now everything depended on the woman lying in that darkened chamber. Jane Seymour carried the future of the Tudor dynasty inside her womb. Days turned into weeks. Jane remained confined, invisible to the world, attended only by midwives and ladies-in-waiting. This was the Tudor way. Women vanished into their chambers pregnant and emerged either triumphant or dead. No men allowed. No doctors. Just ancient rituals passed down through generations of women who understood that childbirth was a doorway between life and death. October 9th arrived. Labor began. The pains came slowly at first, then harder, then relentless. Hour after hour, Jane's body fought to expel the child, but something was wrong. The baby wouldn't come. The midwives whispered anxiously, applying their remedies. Herbal baths, prayers, amulets. Nothing worked. October 10th. Jane was still in labor. The entire palace held its breath. Messengers rode through the night to London, carrying desperate news. By dawn on October 11th, every church bell in the capital was ringing. Friars knelt in the streets. Priests led solemn processions. The mayor and aldermen of London gathered in their robes, praying publicly for the Queen's survival. Because everyone knew the truth. If Jane died without delivering a living son, England would plunge back into chaos. The succession crisis would explode again. Civil war loomed. Henry's rage would be uncontrollable. The labor stretched into its third day. 30 hours of agony. Jane's screams echoed through the palace corridors. The midwives worked frantically, knowing their own lives might depend on the outcome. The baby was now positioned, stuck, refusing to descend into the birth canal. In that era, there were no real options. No surgical interventions, no pain relief. Just waiting, hoping, praying the woman's body would somehow find the strength to push the child into the world before exhaustion or hemorrhage claimed her life. October 12th, 2 o'clock in the morning. After 3 days of hell, after the kingdom had held its collective breath until it nearly suffocated, Jane Seymour finally delivered. A son, alive, screaming, perfect, and named him Edward. And 12 days later, his mother would be dead. The whispers started before Jane's body was even cold. Rumors crept through the corridors of Hampton Court like poison gas. Servants muttered in shadowed hallways. Courtiers exchanged knowing glances. Foreign ambassadors scribbled frantic letters back to their kings. And the story they told was monstrous. They said King Henry VIII had made a choice so brutal, so inhuman, that it would define his legacy for centuries. They said when Jane's labor went wrong, when the baby refused to come, and the midwives admitted defeat, Henry summoned his physicians. And he gave them an order that would haunt history. Cut her open, save the boy, let the mother die. The tale spread like wildfire. In 1538, just months after Jane's death, the French ambassador wrote a letter describing how the Queen's limbs had been stretched during delivery. Some versions claimed her womb was cut before she died. Others whispered darker things, that she was still conscious when the blade went in, that she begged for mercy, that Henry stood watching, cold and unmoved, as his wife was butchered on the birthing bed. By 1643, a historian named Sir Richard Baker published his Chronicle of English Kings. He wrote that Jane Seymour was fain to be ripped to deliver Prince Edward. Ripped. The word itself conjured images of violence, of flesh tearing, of a woman sacrificed on the altar of male succession. But the most haunting version came from an old ballad, a song that appeared around 1560, 23 years after Jane's death. It was called The Death of Queen Jane, and people sang it in taverns and marketplaces across England. In the ballad, Jane lies dying after 6 days of impossible labor. She looks up at Henry with desperate eyes and speaks words that would echo through history. "Henry, my lord, if you love me, send for a surgeon to come here, that he may open my right side and save my baby." In the song, Henry weeps, but he agrees. The surgeon arrives with his blade. Jane is cut open while still alive. The baby is pulled from her body, and as her blood soaks the birthing sheets, Jane whispers her final words before dying in agony. The ballad became legend. The legend became history. And for 500 years, people believed that Jane Seymour was murdered by cesarean section on the orders of her monstrous husband. It fit perfectly with everything the world knew about Henry VIII, the king who broke with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, then had her beheaded 3 years later, the tyrant who dissolved the monasteries and executed anyone who opposed him, the man who would marry 6 times, discarding and destroying women like broken toys. Of course, Henry would sacrifice his wife to get a son. Of course, he would choose the heir over the mother. The story was too perfect, too dramatic, too horrible not to be true. Except it wasn't. Jane Seymour didn't die on October 12th. She didn't bleed out on the birthing bed while surgeons pulled Edward from her opened womb. She lived. For 12 more days, she walked the palace halls. She sat upright. She spoke. She hosted guests. On October 15th, just 3 days after giving birth, Jane attended her son's christening ceremony. She was carried to the chapel in a ceremonial procession, dressed in royal robes, watching as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer baptized Prince Edward before the assembled nobility of England. Witnesses described her sitting in a chair, weak but alive, participating in the greatest triumph of her life. You don't do that after being cut open. In 1537, a cesarean section was a death sentence. Not a dangerous procedure, not a risky operation. A guaranteed execution. The medical knowledge didn't exist. The surgical technique was primitive. Anesthesia wouldn't be invented for another 300 years. Antiseptics wouldn't appear until the 1800s. If a woman was cut open while alive, she died within hours, not days. Hours from shock, from blood loss, from the sheer trauma of having her abdomen sliced open and her uterus carved apart while fully conscious and screaming. There was one famous case. A Swiss butcher named Jakob Neuffer, whose wife suffered through 6 days of obstructed labor in 1500. 13 midwives tried and failed to deliver the baby. In desperation, Neuffer grabbed his butcher's knife and cut his wife open on their kitchen table. Somehow, miraculously, impossibly, she survived. She even went on to have more children. It was considered a divine miracle, an impossible anomaly that proved the rule. Women didn't survive cesarean sections, ever. Even into the 1800s, the mortality rate remained nearly 100%. Mothers died from hemorrhage, from infection, from organ damage. The procedure was only performed as a last resort when the mother was already dead or dying, and the only hope was saving the infant. So if Henry's physicians had cut Jane open on October 12th, she would have been dead by October 13th. Her body would have been prepared for burial. There would be no christening, no procession, no witnesses describing her sitting upright 3 days later. The timeline destroys the myth completely, but there's something else, something even more damning. If Jane had been subjected to a cesarean, if her body had been violated in such a horrific way, it would have been recorded. The royal physicians kept meticulous notes. Ambassadors documented every detail of court life. Someone would have written it down explicitly, not as rumor, but as fact. Instead, the only accounts are whispers, second-hand stories, ballads composed decades later by people who weren't there. Nothing concrete, nothing definitive, just the kind of gossip that forms around mysterious deaths. Jane Seymour wasn't cut open to save Prince Edward, but she did die 12 days after giving birth. And what actually killed her was far more terrifying than any surgical blade. October 16th, 4 days after Edward's birth, Jane woke feeling strange. At first, it seemed like nothing, a slight discomfort, a wave of nausea. But by afternoon, her body betrayed her. Violent diarrhea struck without warning, wave after wave of intestinal cramping that left her weak and trembling. Her attendants rushed to her bedside, alarmed but not yet panicked. Women often experience digestive upset after childbirth. It was unpleasant, but usually passed quickly. Jane's chaplain and physicians issued a careful bulletin to the court. They described what they called a natural lax that had afflicted the queen. They tried to sound optimistic. They wrote that the illness had caused her to lighten and appear to mend by evening. But then they added 5 ominous words. All this night she hath been very sick. The palace atmosphere shifted. Something was wrong. Courtiers exchanged worried glances. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, began writing urgent letters. The Duke of Norfolk sent word to prepare for the worst. Some later blamed spoiled food. They said Jane had eaten things her body couldn't tolerate while recovering from birth. That servants had brought her rich meats and delicacies inappropriate for a woman in her weakened state. Food poisoning seemed like a reasonable explanation for the sudden digestive collapse. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister had taken root. During those 3 days of brutal labor, as Jane's body struggled to expel the malpositioned infant, damage had been done. Microscopic tears in her uterine wall, fragments of placenta or membrane left behind in the womb, invisible wounds that created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. In the 16th century, childbirth was conducted in darkness and ignorance. Midwives worked by candlelight in sealed chambers. They had no concept of germs or infection, no understanding of sterilization. Their hands carried bacteria from one patient to another. The tools they used were rarely clean. The birthing linens were reused without proper washing. Jane's body had become a battlefield between life and death, and the enemy was invisible. The infection began locally, bacteria multiplying in the warm, damaged tissue of her reproductive organs. At first, her immune system fought back. That's why she seemed to improve briefly, why she could sit upright at Edward's christening on October 15th. why she managed to smile and accept congratulations while her son was baptized. But the bacteria were relentless. They spread from the uterus into her abdominal cavity, then into her bloodstream. Modern doctors have a name for this progression: puerperal sepsis, childbed fever, an infection that killed tens of thousands of women every year in the centuries before antibiotics. Jane couldn't have known what was happening inside her. She only knew that 4 days after delivering England's greatest treasure, her body was turning against her. The digestive symptoms were just the beginning, the harbinger of something that would consume her completely within a week. And there was absolutely nothing anyone could do to stop it. October 17th, 5 days post-birth. Jane received last rites. The Bishop of Carlisle was summoned to her bedside. He stood over her pale, trembling form and administered the sacrament for the dying. The holy oil touched her forehead. Prayers for her departing soul echoed through the chamber. Everyone present understood what this meant. The Queen of England was preparing to meet her Maker, but then something unexpected happened. Jane rallied. Her fever broke temporarily. Color returned to her cheeks. She managed to sit up and speak coherently. The court breathed a collective sigh of relief. Perhaps the worst had passed. Perhaps divine intervention had spared her. Messages went out across London announcing the Queen's miraculous recovery. They were premature. What Jane's physicians didn't understand was that infections follow patterns. They surge and retreat. They create false hope before delivering the killing blow. Modern doctors recognize these deceptive improvements as the calm before the final storm, the body's last desperate attempt to fight back before the bacteria overwhelm every defense. October 19th. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang out once more. Another solemn procession marched through London streets. Priests led prayers begging God to spare the Queen, because despite the optimistic bulletins, everyone at court knew Jane was slipping away. Inside her body, the infection had metastasized beyond control. What began as localized inflammation in her uterus had transformed into full systemic sepsis. Bacteria flooded her bloodstream like an invading army. Her organs began shutting down one by one. The symptoms became horrific, waves of fever alternating with bone-chilling cold. Her heart raced desperately, trying to pump blood through contaminated vessels. Her kidneys struggled to filter the toxins accumulating in her system. Her brain, starved of oxygen and poisoned by infection, began misfiring. Jane drifted in and out of consciousness. During lucid moments, she recognized the faces surrounding her bed. Her brothers Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour keeping vigil. Her ladies-in-waiting weeping silently. Perhaps even glimpses of Henry, though no record confirms his presence. But increasingly, she inhabited a twilight world between life and death. Fever dreams twisted reality into nightmares. Her body convulsed with chills despite the fire blazing in her chamber. She couldn't keep down food or water. Everything her attendants tried to give her came back up almost immediately. The infection had claimed her abdominal cavity, peritonitis, the lining of her organs inflamed and dying. Every breath brought stabbing pain, every movement agony. Her belly swelled and hardened as fluid and pus accumulated inside. October 23rd, 8 o'clock in the evening. Henry was called to Jane's bedside for what everyone knew would be the final time. Whether he actually came remains unknown. Court protocol demanded his presence, but perhaps he couldn't bear to watch another wife die. Perhaps he'd already moved on mentally to the next marriage, the next attempt at securing his dynasty. The Bishop of Carlisle returned. He administered last rites for the second time. This time, there would be no miraculous recovery. Jane Seymour had given England its prince. Now England watched as the infection she contracted delivering him consumed her from the inside out. October 24th, 1537. 2 o'clock in the morning. Hampton Court Palace fell silent. Jane Seymour took her last breath. No dramatic final words were recorded. No poetic farewell to her infant son or her king. Just the quiet cessation of a body that could fight no longer. After 12 days of deterioration, after brief moments of hope shattered by cascading organ failure, after unspeakable pain that no opiate could touch, Jane simply stopped. Her ladies-in-waiting surrounding the bed wept openly. Some had served her since she first came to court as a lady-in-waiting herself to Queen Catherine of Aragon years earlier. They'd watched her rise from obscurity to become Queen of England. They'd celebrated when she finally conceived. They'd prayed desperately as labor stretched into its third hellish day. And now they witnessed the inevitable conclusion. The room smelled of death. Despite the herbs burning in braziers, despite the perfumes dabbed on handkerchiefs held to noble noses, the stench of infection permeated everything. Jane's body had been rotting from the inside while she still breathed. The sepsis that killed her produced toxins that seeped through her pores, giving her skin a grayish pallor, and her sweat a sickly sweet odor that no amount of rosewater could mask. Within hours, the embalmers arrived. On October 25th, they performed their grim work. Her internal organs were removed, as was customary for royal corpses. Her entrails were buried within the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court, while her body was preserved for the state funeral to come. When they opened her abdomen, they would have seen the devastating damage, the inflamed peritoneum. The pus accumulated in her abdominal cavity, physical evidence of the infection that consumed her. Jane's body was dressed in golden robes. Royal jewels adorned her neck and fingers. A crown was placed upon her head. She looked magnificent in death, transformed from the suffering woman who de-thrashed in fever dreams into a serene queen ready to meet eternity. For a week, she lay in state in the presence chamber at Hampton Court. Gentlemen and ladies from her household kept constant vigil, kneeling beside her coffin in shifts that lasted through day and night. Among them were her brothers, Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour, the uncles of England's new prince. Their sister's death elevated them to the most powerful positions in the kingdom. They would become protectors of young Prince Edward, controllers of his upbringing, puppet masters of the next reign. Henry VIII retreated to Westminster Palace. Court protocol dictated that kings did not attend their wives' funerals. But more than tradition kept him away. Henry was already looking forward, not back. Jane had served her purpose. She'd given him the son he craved. Her death was unfortunate, but not catastrophic. On October 31st, the Feast of All Saints, Jane's coffin was moved into the Chapel Royal. Prayers were said for her soul. And on November 12th, 1537, 19 days after her death, Jane Seymour was finally laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. She was 28 years old. She'd been queen for 17 months, and she would be the only one of Henry as 6 wives buried beside him when his own death came 10 years later. When they told Henry VIII that Jane was gone, he wept. At least, that's what the official records claim. The King of England, the man who, de-broken with Rome, and executed 2 of his closest advisers and beheaded his second wife, supposedly mourned Jane Seymour with genuine devastation. Court observers wrote that he retreated to Westminster Palace, where he kept himself close and secret, overcome with sorrow. But look closer at his actions, and a different picture emerges. Henry ordered Hampton Court draped in black fabric, every room shrouded in funeral cloth, the palace transformed into a monument of mourning. He decreed that the court would observe an extended period of grief. Masses were said daily for Jane's soul. His household wore black for months. Yet Henry himself didn't attend her lying in state. He didn't keep vigil beside her coffin as her brothers did. He didn't accompany her body to Windsor Castle for burial. Royal protocol excused him from these duties, yes. Kings didn't attend their wives' funerals, but Henry could have broken protocol. He'd broken every other rule when it suited him. Instead, he sent his daughter Mary to serve as chief mourner. The same Mary he'd declared a bastard when he divorced her mother Catherine of Aragon. The same Mary he'd forced to acknowledge Anne Boleyn as rightful queen. Now she walked behind Jane's coffin, while Henry remained safely distant. The funeral itself was magnificent, no expense spared. Jane's coffin was carried in grand procession from Hampton Court to Windsor. Hundreds of mourners lined the route. Torches blazed through the November darkness. At St. George's Chapel, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer conducted the burial service with all appropriate ceremony. Jane was laid to rest in the choir of the chapel, not in some forgotten corner or humble grave. She received a tomb befitting a queen, the only one of Henry's 6 wives who would ultimately rest beside him when his own death came 10 years later. But was this honor given out of love, or something more calculated? Jane had accomplished what Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn could not. She'd given Henry his son, his precious male heir, his justification for everything he'd done. The divorces, the executions, the religious upheaval that tore England apart, all of it validated by the living, breathing boy sleeping in the royal nursery. That boy's mother deserved proper recognition. That's what the tomb represented. Not love, gratitude. Jane had earned her place beside him in death by giving him what he wanted in life. Within weeks of her burial, Henry was already considering his next marriage. His counselors began compiling lists of eligible foreign princesses and English noblewomen. The king needed more sons. One heir wasn't enough. Edward could die. Children died all the time. Henry required backups, spare heirs, a surplus of male children to secure his dynasty. Jane Seymour was gone, mourned appropriately, buried with honor. And now it was time to move forward, time to find wife number 4, because kingdoms don't wait for grief to pass. And kings certainly don't remain celibate out of respect for the dead. Henry had proven that repeatedly. Jane would be no exception. 2 years and 2 months after Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII stood in the chapel at Greenwich Palace preparing to marry again. January 6, 1540. His 4th bride approached the altar, Anne of Cleves, a German princess Henry had never met in person until weeks earlier. A woman chosen through portrait and political negotiation. A strategic alliance dressed up as romance. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had orchestrated the entire arrangement. After Jane's death, Cromwell convinced Henry that England needed Protestant allies on the continent. The Duchy of Cleves fit perfectly, and Duke William's sister Anne was available, reportedly beautiful and of appropriate royal blood. Hans Holbein was dispatched to paint Anne's portrait. He returned with a flattering image that pleased Henry immensely. The king studied the painting and approved the match. Treaties were signed. Anne began her journey to England in December 1539. But when Henry met his bride-to-be at Rochester Castle on New Year's Eve, reality shattered expectation. He'd arrived in disguise, a romantic gesture meant to surprise and delight Anne. Instead, she remained polite but distant, failing to recognize the costumed stranger who burst into her chamber and kissed her uninvited. Henry revealed his true identity, expecting warmth and gratitude. Anne's expression remained carefully neutral. The next morning, Henry confided to Thomas Cromwell words that would seal multiple fates. "I like her not." Too late. The political alliance was finalized. Anne's brother expected the marriage to proceed. Canceling now would insult the Duchy of Cleves and potentially create enemies where Henry needed friends. Cromwell urged him forward. Henry had no choice. The wedding happened on schedule. Henry repeated vows he'd spoken 3 times before. Anne became Queen of England, and immediately the marriage became a catastrophe. Henry couldn't consummate it. Whether from lack of attraction or something more physical, he found himself unable to perform his marital duties. Night after night, they shared a bed. Night after night, nothing happened. Courtiers whispered. Anne remained silent and dignified. Henry grew increasingly frustrated and humiliated. By May, just 5 months after the wedding, Henry was already courting someone new, Catherine Howard, a vivacious teenage girl who served in Anne's household. Young, flirtatious, everything Anne was not. Henry became obsessed. On June 24th, Anne was sent away from court. Henry claimed plague threatened London, and she'd be safer at Richmond Palace. She went without protest, perhaps sensing what was coming. July 6th, official notification arrived. Henry wanted an annulment. The marriage had never been consummated. Therefore, it was invalid. Anne could contest it, fight back, refuse to cooperate. She didn't. Anne of Cleves proved smarter than any of Henry's previous wives. She agreed to everything immediately, signed whatever documents were placed before her, returned her wedding ring, and asked that it be broken into pieces as a thing of no value. In exchange, Henry granted her Richmond Palace, Hever Castle, a generous income, and the title of King's beloved sister. She would rank above every woman in England, except Henry's daughters and future wives. July 28th, 1540. Less than 3 weeks after the annulment, Henry married Catherine Howard. The same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill for his role in the disastrous Cleves marriage. Anne of Cleves lived another 17 years in comfortable retirement. Jane Seymour had been dead for less than 3 years, and Henry was already on wife number 5. Catherine Howard was 17 years old when Henry VIII decided she would be his next queen, maybe younger. Her exact birth date remains lost to history, but she was definitely a teenager. A girl with virtually no education, no political experience, and a scandalous past she desperately tried to hide. Henry was 49, obese, suffering from a festering leg wound that never healed. A grotesque parody of the athletic prince who'd once jousted and danced and seduced his way through court. But he saw Catherine and convinced himself he'd found salvation. She'd arrived at court in late 1539 to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves. Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, had arranged the position. The same Duke of Norfolk who'd pushed his niece Anne Boleyn into Henry's path years earlier. The same family that specialized in offering up beautiful young women to an aging tyrant in exchange for power and influence. Catherine was petite, pretty, vivacious in ways Anne of Cleves would never be. She knew how to flirt, how to charm, how to make an old man feel young again. Henry became utterly obsessed. He showered her with gifts, jewels, gowns, properties. His eyes followed her everywhere. Court gossips whispered that the king crept too near another lady while still married to his 4th wife. Anne of Cleves noticed. Of course she noticed. Her husband barely touched her, but couldn't stop touching Catherine Howard. The humiliation must have been excruciating, but Anne was smart enough to stay silent. July 9th, 1540. Henry's marriage to Anne was officially annulled. 19 days later, on July 28th, Henry married Catherine Howard in a private ceremony at Oatlands Palace in Surrey. The same day, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill for arranging the disastrous Cleves marriage. Blood and matrimony, Henry's favorite combination. He called Catherine his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood. He was convinced this marriage would be different. This young, vibrant girl would give him more sons. She'd restore his youth. She'd erase the failures of his previous marriages and prove he still had the virility of a conquering king. Catherine adopted the royal motto, "No other will but his." Pretty words that would later sound grotesquely ironic. August 8th, 1540. Catherine was formally acknowledged as Queen of England at Hampton Court Palace. Prayers were said in the Chapel Royal. The entire court celebrated. Henry indulged her every whim. Whatever Catherine wanted, she received. New gowns arrived weekly. Banquets were held in her honor. The king could barely keep his hands off her, but Catherine Howard carried secrets. Dangerous secrets about her past, about men she'd known before Henry, about relationships that went far beyond innocent flirtation. And she was about to make the most catastrophic mistake of her short life. Because while Henry was convinced he'd married a virgin rose, Catherine was already planning how to continue an affair with a young courtier named Thomas Culpeper, a member of the king's privy chamber, someone who had access to the royal apartments at all hours, someone who would help Catherine commit treason against the most dangerous man in England. The marriage that began with such hope would end in blood just 16 months later. Thomas Culpeper was everything Henry VIII used to be: young, athletic, handsome, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber with access to the most intimate spaces of the royal household. He dressed the king, attended him in his private chambers, sometimes even slept near Henry's bedchamber to be available at a moment's notice. He was trusted completely, a favorite, almost like a son. And he was sleeping with Henry's teenage wife. Or at least they were meeting in secret, late at night, in locked rooms, with only Lady Jane Rochford standing guard outside the door. Jane Rochford, the widow of George Bullen, Anne Bullen's executed brother, the woman who'd testified against her own husband during Anne's fall, helping send him to his death on charges of incest. Now she was facilitating another queen's affair. Perhaps she craved the thrill. Perhaps she enjoyed the power of holding such dangerous secrets. Perhaps she simply couldn't resist being part of the drama. The meetings began sometime in early 1541. Catherine would send word through Jane Rochford. Culpeper would arrive after dark, slipping through corridors while the king slept elsewhere. They'd meet in Catherine's private chambers or in Jane's rooms, sometimes for hours, often past midnight. What happened during those meetings remains one of Tudor history's great mysteries. Catherine later confessed to giving Culpeper gifts, velvet and silk, personal tokens. She wrote him at least one letter, discovered later among his possessions. In it, she called him her lover. She wrote that she longed for him, that his promises meant everything to her. The letter was passionate, intimate, desperate. Under torture, Culpeper claimed they'd kissed, that Catherine had initiated physical contact, that she'd expressed love for him. But he insisted, even as they prepared to execute him, that they'd never consummated the relationship, never crossed that final line. Catherine's confession was more ambiguous. She admitted the meetings, acknowledged the gifts and the letter, confessed that Culpeper had used her in ways that suggested intimacy. But whether she meant sexual intercourse or something less explicit, she never clarified. The most damning evidence wasn't what they did. It was what they intended to do. In the spring of 1541, Henry decided to take Catherine on a royal progress through the north of England, a political tour designed to show royal strength in regions known for rebellion. The entourage included hundreds of courtiers, guards, and attendants, including Thomas Culpeper. The affair continued on the road, in Pontefract, in Lincoln, in York. While Henry celebrated his young bride publicly, she was sneaking away to meet Culpeper privately. Jane Rochford arranged everything, standing watch outside doors, deflecting questions, creating alibis. They were playing the most dangerous game imaginable. If discovered, the consequences weren't just scandal or divorce. This was treason. Catherine's body belonged to the king. Any child she bore had to be unquestionably Henry's. If she'd been with another man, if any doubt existed about paternity, she'd contaminated the royal bloodline. That was a crime punishable by death. And someone was watching. Someone who knew about Catherine's past. Someone who would soon whisper the truth into the right ears. The game was almost over. November 2nd, 1541. All Saints' Day. Henry VIII attended Mass at Hampton Court Chapel, thanking God for the happiness he'd found with his young wife. While he prayed, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer slipped the letter into his prayer book. Henry discovered it during the service, unfolded it, read words that shattered his world completely. The letter detailed Catherine Howard's sexual history before their marriage. Her relationship with Francis Dereham, a man who'd once lived with her in the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk's household. The nights he'd spent in her bed. The plans they'd allegedly made to marry. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter also mentioned Thomas Culpeper, secret meetings, late-night encounters. A relationship that might have continued throughout their marriage and during the recent royal progress north. Henry refused to believe it. Impossible. His rose without a thorn. His perfect young bride. She couldn't have deceived him so completely. The accusations were lies spread by enemies trying to destroy his happiness. He ordered an investigation, expecting vindication. Instead, they found proof. Francis Dereham confessed under interrogation. Yes, he'd known Catherine intimately before her marriage. Yes, they'd conducted a relationship at the Dowager Duchess's house in Lambeth. He claimed they'd been pre-contracted to marry, which would have made Catherine's marriage to Henry technically invalid. Thomas Culpeper was arrested next. Under questioning, he admitted the secret meetings, acknowledged receiving gifts from the Queen, confessed that Catherine had written him love letters. But he swore they'd never consummated the affair. They'd only talked. Kissed perhaps, nothing more. Then they found Catherine's letter among his possessions. The one where she'd signed herself yours as long as life endures. Where she'd called him her lover and expressed desperate longing. Lady Jane Rochford broke completely during interrogation. She described arranging the meetings, standing guard outside locked doors, facilitating every encounter. She claimed Catherine had seduced Culpeper, that the young man had tried to resist, but the Queen wouldn't let him retreat. November 14th, Catherine was stripped of her title and moved to Sion Abbey, a former monastery converted into a prison. She was no longer queen, just Catherine Howard, a traitor awaiting judgment. December 1st, Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were tried at Guildhall and convicted of treason. Both were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The full horror of a traitor's death. Culpeper begged Henry for mercy, for the clean death of beheading instead of butchery. Henry granted it, perhaps some lingering affection for the young man who'd served him so faithfully. Perhaps he couldn't bear the thought of watching someone he trusted torn apart at Tyburn. December 10th. Both men were executed. Culpeper received a swift beheading. Dereham suffered the full sentence. Hanged until nearly dead, then cut down still conscious. Castrated, disemboweled while he screamed, finally beheaded. His body hacked into quarters. Their heads were placed on spikes on London Bridge, left there to rot as warnings. Catherine remained imprisoned at Sion, waiting for her own death, knowing that when they came for her, she'd pass beneath those heads on her way to the Tower. The girl who'd wanted to be queen was about to learn the price of betraying a king. February 10th, 1542. Catherine Howard was brought by barge to the Tower of London. She passed beneath London Bridge at sunset. Above her, mounted on iron spikes, the decomposing heads of Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham stared down with empty eye sockets. Their skin had turned black. Carrion birds had been picking at them for 2 months. Catherine would have seen them, would have smelled the rot, would have understood that she was sailing directly toward the same fate. The barge glided through Traitor's Gate, that water entrance used only for prisoners condemned to die. Anne Boleyn had entered the Tower this way 5 years earlier. Now her cousin followed the same path into the same nightmare. Catherine was led to her cell, 18 years old, possibly younger. A girl who'd wanted jewels and gowns and the excitement of being queen. Now she had 3 days left to live. On the night of February 12th, witnesses reported something that would haunt Tudor history. Catherine asked for the execution block to be brought to her room. She wanted to practice, to rehearse the mechanics of her own beheading. How to kneel properly, how to position her neck, how to make sure the executioner's aim would be true. She spent hours kneeling on the floor of her cell, laying her head against the wooden block, imagining the axe falling. A teenage girl rehearsing her death because she was terrified of a botched execution, terrified of the blade missing, of needing multiple blows, of dying slowly while the crowd watched. February 13th, 7 in the morning. Catherine was brought to Tower Green, the same private execution ground where Anne Boleyn had died, where Lady Salisbury had been butchered in a botched beheading that took 11 blows, where queens and nobles met their ends away from public view because their deaths were too politically sensitive for crowds. Catherine wore a black velvet gown. She was so weak from terror and despair that guards had to support her walk to the scaffold. Her legs wouldn't hold her weight. She climbed the wooden steps with assistance. A small crowd of officials and nobles had gathered to witness, required by law to confirm that royal justice had been carried out. Among them stood Catherine's uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who'd pushed her toward Henry in the first place. Catherine managed a brief speech, her voice trembling. She confessed that her punishment was deserved, that she'd violated the king's trust, that she died acknowledging her crimes. The traditional words of a condemned traitor accepting judgment. Then she knelt, positioned her neck on the block exactly as she'd practiced through that endless final night. The executioner raised his axe, one clean blow. Catherine Howard's head fell into the straw. Moments later, Lady Jane Rochford was brought forward, the woman who'd facilitated every secret meeting, who'd arranged the affair that destroyed them all. She knelt in Catherine's blood and placed her own neck on the still wet block. Another swing, another head in the straw. Both bodies were carried to the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula within the Tower grounds, buried without ceremony near Anne Boleyn's remains. 3 of Henry's 6 wives now rested in unmarked graves beneath the chapel floor. Catherine had been queen for 16 months. She'd been 18 years old. Henry VIII was already considering wife number 6. July 12th, 1543. Hampton Court Palace. Henry VIII married for the 6th and final time. His bride was Catherine Parr, 31 years old, twice widowed, educated, intelligent. A woman who knew exactly what she was walking into when she accepted the king's proposal, because accepting wasn't really a choice. Henry was 52, morbidly obese. His legendary leg ulcer wept constantly, filling his chambers with the stench of infected flesh. He could barely walk, had to be hoisted up staircases by mechanical devices operated by teams of servants. His temperament had grown increasingly paranoid and violent. He'd executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, lost one to childbirth. Catherine knew all of this. She'd watched from court as Catherine Howard was dragged to the Tower just 18 months earlier. She'd seen what happened to women who displeased the king, but she also had a secret, one that made this marriage particularly cruel. Catherine was in love with someone else. Thomas Seymour, the younger brother of Jane Seymour, a handsome courtier who'd been courting Catherine before Henry's interest forced him away. Thomas had been sent to Brussels on diplomatic assignment, specifically to remove him from court, while the king pursued his chosen bride. Catherine later wrote that marrying Henry felt like sacrificing her personal desires for a higher duty. Pretty words that masked the reality. She had no choice. When Henry VIII wanted you, refusal meant suspicion. Suspicion meant investigation. Investigation could mean death, so Catherine married him, became his 6th queen, entered a marriage where 3 of her predecessors had died violently or miserably. But Catherine Parr wasn't like the others. She was smarter, more careful. She understood how to navigate the lethal currents of Henry's court without drowning. She positioned herself not as a romantic partner, but as a companion, a nurse, a stepmother to Henry's 3 children. She reconciled the king with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom he declared bastards during previous marriage upheavals. She brought young Prince Edward into the royal household more frequently. She created the family dynamic Henry desperately craved in his declining years. In 1544, Henry gave Catherine unprecedented power. He appointed her regent of England, while he personally commanded military campaigns in France. For 2 months, Catherine ruled the kingdom in Henry's name. She signed royal proclamations, made governmental decisions, commanded forces on the Scottish border. No other wife had been granted such authority. Henry had never trusted anyone that much, but Catherine had proven herself invaluable, not as a sexual partner or breeding vessel, as a capable administrator and loyal companion. She was also dangerously religious, a passionate Protestant reformer who believed in translating the Bible into English, so common people could read Scripture without priestly interpretation. She wrote and published theological texts under her own name, the first Queen of England to do so, bold, possibly reckless, because Henry's religious views shifted depending on political convenience. He'd broken with Rome but maintained many Catholic practices, and around him lurked conservative enemies who saw Catherine's Protestant advocacy as heresy. Enemies who would soon try to have her arrested, interrogated, and burned at the stake for religious treason. Catherine Parr had survived marrying Henry VIII, but she wasn't safe yet. January 28th, 1547, 2 o'clock in the morning. King Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. He'd been dying for months, his massive body ravaged by infections, obesity, and probably diabetes. His leg ulcers had spread poison through his system. He could barely breathe, couldn't move without mechanical assistance. The man who'd once been England's as Golden Prince had become a grotesque monument to excess and decay. Catherine Parr had nursed him through his final decline, changed his putrid bandages, endured the stench of his rotting flesh, sat with him during his rages and paranoia. She survived 4 years of marriage to the most dangerous man in England by becoming indispensable as caretaker rather than lover. Now, finally, she was free. Within weeks, Catherine did something scandalous. She married Thomas Seymour, the man she'd loved before Henry claimed her. The marriage happened so quickly that court gossips were shocked. A widowed queen was supposed to observe at least a year of mourning. Catherine waited barely 4 months. She was 35 years old. She'd been married 3 times, always to older men chosen for political or financial reasons. This was her chance at genuine happiness. Thomas was handsome, charming, younger than her previous husbands. She'd sacrificed her desires once to marry Henry. Now she seized what remained of her life. But Thomas Seymour was poison disguised as romance. He'd been pursuing the teenage Princess Elizabeth, Henry's daughter, a girl Catherine had raised as a stepmother and friend. Thomas had wanted Elizabeth's hand in marriage immediately after Henry's death, but the royal council refused. So he married Catherine instead, perhaps for love, more likely for access to Elizabeth, who came to live with them. What happened next remains one of Tudor history's most disturbing episodes. Thomas began entering Elizabeth's bedchamber in the early mornings, wearing only his nightshirt. He'd tickle her, slap her playfully. Once he tried to kiss her while she was still in bed. Catherine sometimes participated, holding Elizabeth down while Thomas cut her dress to ribbons with a knife, claiming it was all innocent horseplay. Elizabeth was 14 years old, living with her stepmother and the man who clearly wanted her. The situation became unbearable. In May 1548, Catherine finally acknowledged what everyone could see. She sent Elizabeth away to live with Sir Anthony Denny's family at Cheshunt, the girl she'd loved as a daughter, removed from her household because Catherine's husband couldn't stop harassing her. August 30th, 1548. Catherine went into labor at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire. She delivered a daughter, named her Mary. For a brief moment, Catherine seemed happy. 36 years old, finally a mother, finally experiencing something she'd never had before. Then the fever came. The same infection that had killed Jane Seymour 11 years earlier. Puerperal sepsis, childbed fever. The invisible killer that claimed so many women after birth. Catherine lasted 6 days, delirious, in agony, crying out against Thomas in her final hours, accusing him of betraying her with other women. The man she'd loved had broken her heart even as infection broke her body. September 5th, 1548. Catherine Parr died at Sudeley Castle, the only one of Henry's wives to survive him. Dead less than 2 years after his passing. Killed by the same infection that claimed Jane Seymour. The circle had closed. March 20th, 1549. Tower Hill, London. Thomas Seymour walked to the scaffold. He was 39 years old. Handsome, arrogant, utterly convinced until the final moment that someone would save him. That his brother Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, wouldn't actually let the execution proceed. That royal mercy would arrive at the last second. It didn't. After Catherine Parr's death in September 1548, Thomas had spiraled completely out of control. With no wife to restrain his ambitions, he'd pursued Princess Elizabeth with renewed intensity, writing her letters, sending gifts, making it clear he wanted to marry her now that Catherine was conveniently dead. Elizabeth was 15 years old. She'd already been traumatized by Thomas's morning visits to her bedchamber when she lived with him and Catherine. His inappropriate touching. The incident where he'd cut her gown to shreds while Catherine held her down. She'd written "touch me" not on one of Catherine's letters, then crossed it out, terrified of speaking directly against him. Now he was trying to make her his wife, and Elizabeth was second in line to the throne. The royal council couldn't ignore it anymore. Thomas wasn't just a predator harassing a teenage girl. He was attempting to marry into the royal succession, to seize control of England's government. His brother Edward controlled young King Edward VI as Lord Protector. Thomas wanted equal power through marrying Elizabeth. In January 1549, he was arrested. The charges were devastating. 33 counts of treason. Attempting to marry Princess Elizabeth without council permission. Plotting to overthrow his brother as Lord Protector. Trying to kidnap the 10-year-old King Edward. Corruption. Embezzlement. Conspiracy. Elizabeth was interrogated for weeks. Royal investigators grilled her about every interaction with Thomas. Every letter. Every gift. Every moment they'd been alone together. They wanted her to confess to a sexual relationship, to admit complicity in his treasonous schemes. Elizabeth denied everything with brilliant precision. Yes, Thomas had visited her bedchamber inappropriately. Yes, he'd behaved improperly. But no, she hadn't encouraged him. No, she hadn't agreed to marry him. No, she hadn't participated in any conspiracy. She maintained perfect composure under interrogation that would have broken most 15-year-olds. Her governess Kat Ashley and her coffer Thomas Perry weren't as strong. Under pressure, they revealed the disturbing details, the morning visits, the tickling, the wrestling, the gown-cutting incident, everything that had happened at Chelsea Manor while Catherine was still alive. Parliament passed a bill of attainder against Thomas. No trial. Just a legislative declaration of guilt. His brother Edward Seymour signed the death warrant. Perhaps he genuinely believed Thomas was guilty. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to eliminate a rival. On the scaffold, Thomas finally realized no rescue was coming. He gave a brief speech, acknowledged his crimes in vague terms, asked God's forgiveness. The axe fell. Thomas Seymour's head rolled into the straw. He'd destroyed Catherine Parr's happiness, traumatized Princess Elizabeth, nearly derailed the Tudor succession through his grotesque ambitions, and in the end, his own brother sent him to his death. Jane Seymour had died giving birth to Prince Edward. Her brother Thomas died trying to exploit that same prince's succession. The Seymour family's rise and fall was complete. January 22nd, 1552. Tower Hill, London. Edward Seymour walked to the same scaffold where his brother Thomas had died 3 years earlier. Jane Seymour's eldest brother, the man who'd risen higher than anyone could have imagined. Lord Protector of England, the Duke of Somerset, the uncle who'd virtually ruled the kingdom in young King Edward VI's name. Now he was being executed for treason by the very nephew he'd protected. Edward Seymour's fall had been inevitable. He'd accumulated too much power, made too many enemies, ruled England with near absolute authority, while the actual king remained a puppet child. The same council members he'd sidelined and humiliated waited for their chance to destroy him. That chance came in October 1549, when John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, orchestrated a coup. Edward Seymour was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and stripped of his titles. The charges mirrored those brought against his brother Thomas, attempting to usurp royal authority, conspiracy, treason. But unlike Thomas, Edward was initially spared, released after several months, partially restored to favor. Perhaps young King Edward felt genuine affection for his uncle. Perhaps the council believed one Seymour execution was enough. It wasn't. In October 1551, Edward Seymour was arrested again. New charges. More serious accusations. Plotting to murder John Dudley, now Duke of Northumberland. Planning to kidnap the king. Raising illegal forces. The evidence was thin, mostly based on hearsay and testimony from enemies. But it was enough. The trial happened on December 1st, 1551. Edward Seymour denied everything, pleaded his innocence before a packed court. The jury acquitted him of treason, but convicted him of felony for gathering armed men. The distinction was meaningless. Both carried a death sentence. King Edward VI, 13 years old, signed his uncle's death warrant. The boy Jane Seymour had died giving birth to. The nephew Edward Seymour had protected and ruled for. He put his name to the document that would send his mother's brother to the scaffold. On execution day, rumors spread through London that Edward Seymour would be rescued, that armed men loyal to him would storm the scaffold. The authorities were so nervous they stationed troops throughout the city. Cannons were positioned at strategic points. The tower's defenses were reinforced. No rescue came. Edward Seymour gave his final speech, acknowledged his faults, proclaimed his loyalty to the king, asked forgiveness from God and man. Then he knelt. The axe fell. Jane Seymour's eldest brother joined her younger brother Thomas in death. 2 years later, in July 1553, King Edward VI died. Tuberculosis consumed him at 15 years old. The boy Jane Seymour had sacrificed her life to deliver. The male heir Henry VIII had destroyed so many lives pursuing, dead before reaching adulthood. Edward's death triggered a succession crisis. His attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne failed after 9 days. Mary Tudor, Henry's daughter by Catherine of Aragon, seized power and restored Catholicism. All of Jane Seymour's suffering, all those deaths, all that bloodshed and political maneuvering. The son who was supposed to secure the Tudor dynasty barely survived childhood and left no heir. The cycle of destruction Jane's death had initiated finally consumed everyone connected to it. Both her brothers executed. Her son dead at 15. Her sacrifice rendered meaningless by disease and political chaos. The curse of the Seymours was complete.